Winter arrived early in the Sawtooth Range of Idaho Territory. Not with drama, not with warning, just cold, settling in like a fact that could not be argued with. On the frontier, fire was life, and firewood was currency. Every cabin understood the math. Without fire, hands stiffened, food went cold, water turned solid. A house without flame became a shelter in name only. So men split, stacked, and guarded their wood piles like savings. But that winter brought a problem no one liked to name. Rain fell before the snow. Snow melted under weak daylight. Then night locked it all back into ice. Water crept into the grain of every log. Wet wood does not burn. It hisses. It steams. It fights the flame. The fire shrinks. Smoke thickens. Heat disappears upward. A man can have a full shed and still freeze beside his own stove. Inside the cabins, the sound was always the same. A match struck, a log placed, then the slow, mocking sizzle, fire dying in the hands of someone who needed it to live. Men split more wood. They stacked it tighter. They dragged tarps over the piles and weighed them down with stones. Nothing changed. The wood stayed wet. The nights stayed long. Children slept closer to the stove. Women wiped soot from shelves each morning. Chimneys clogged. Fires burned fast and cold. The valley learned to endure it. No one called it failure. They called it winter. They called it mountains. They called it the price of living where comfort never came easy. Nature did not explain itself. It never does. It only enforced the rules it had always followed. And water, once inside wood, refused to leave. This was the quiet crisis of that season. Not starvation, not wolves, but fire that could not be trusted. Heat that vanished when it was needed most. This wasn't just a story of hardship. It was a story of a solution. We are here to share the real survival techniques tested by the harshest conditions imaginable. Not theory, but history. If you're here for that kind of knowledge, hit subscribe and give this video a like. It's the signal that helps us find more of these vital stories from the past. The valley accepted the wet wood. They worked around it. They suffered through it. One man did not. The way firewood was stored in the valley had never been a mystery. Every cabin followed the same pattern. A lean-to built against the north wall. A slanted roof to shed snow. Nothing fancy. Logs were stacked off the ground on poles or flat stones. Tarred canvas was pulled tight over the top. Rocks were laid along the edges to keep the wind from lifting it. In drier country, this was enough. For years, it had worked. In places where cold stayed cold and air stayed dry, wood cured slowly and stayed that way. Snow fell, but it did not soak. Rain was rare. Men trusted what they had learned. They trusted what their fathers had done. They trusted systems that had already proven themselves. There was no recklessness in that. But the Sawtooth Range did not play by those old rules. Here, winter moved back and forth. Daylight softened the snow just enough to release water. Night froze it again before it could drain away. Moisture slipped under tarps. It pooled between logs. It followed gravity into every crack. Then it locked itself inside the wood when the temperature dropped. This was the failure no one planned for. Not rot, not mold, but wood that looked solid and felt heavy, yet carried water deep in its grain. Each freeze trapped that water tighter. Each thaw pulled more in. The lean-to stopped being protection and became a slow-working seal. Men adjusted, as frontier people always do. They split more. They burned faster. They accepted shorter fires and longer nights. No one mocked the system. No one called it foolish. Because it wasn't. It had simply been built for a different climate. This was not ignorance. It was experience meeting new conditions. Hard-earned knowledge, running into a winter that refused to stay consistent. Nature had not become cruel. It had only shifted the terms. And the old methods, once reliable, could not keep up. The valley felt it, cabin by cabin, not as a single disaster, but as a steady drain of effort, heat slipping away day after day. What used to work had stopped working, and no one yet knew what would replace it. The man who did not accept the wet wood was not known in the valley for bold ideas or loud opinions. He was known for work that held together when it was shaken, soaked, and put under weight. His name was Xander Cole, and before he ever built a cabin in the Sawtooth Range, he had been a railway car builder farther south in Utah Territory, working wood that moved for a living. Rail cars taught a hard kind of discipline. Every joint had to carry load, every beam had to flex without failing, and every mistake was punished by motion, rain, and time. Water was the enemy there too. It crept into seams, it swelled boards, it loosened fasteners that once felt tight. A rail car did not collapse all at once. It failed slowly. First a groan, then a shift, then a break that could not be argued with. Xander learned that lesson early, not from books, from repairs made in the rain, and inspections done after long hauls through storms. He learned to watch where water went. He learned how it pooled, how it traveled along grain, how it waited for cold to finish the job. By the time he moved north, he understood something most men did not need to say out loud. Cold was dangerous, but water, trapped and patient, was worse. Xander came to the Sawtooth Range with his wife, Eliza Cole, and their young daughter, still small enough to be carried inside a coat when the wind cut too hard. They built their cabin with care. The foundation was squared. The sill logs were lifted and sealed. The joints were tight, not rushed. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was guessed at. It was a good house by frontier standards. Strong, plain, honest. The kind of place meant to last, not impress. Eliza understood the work without needing it explained. She had lived through enough winters to know that a man's choices were measured by how well his family slept in February. Xander did not talk about improvements. He did not complain about the weather. He watched. He waited. He measured. And long before the first real freeze set in, he had already learned to hate water more than he feared the cold. The first full winter did not arrive all at once. It crept in through mornings that felt heavier than they should, through nights when the stove burned down too fast, through small failures that added up. The coal woodpile looked no different from the others. Split clean, stacked straight, covered tight. Yet each morning began the same way. Xander pried frozen logs apart with the flat of his axe. The wood came loose, reluctantly. Edges cracked. Ice dust fell. The logs were heavier than dry wood should be, as if they were carrying something extra inside. When the fire was lit, it struggled. Flame caught, then shrank. Steam rose before heat did. The stove breathed out smoke instead of warmth. Inside the cabin, the air turned sharp. Their daughter rubbed her eyes and turned away from the hearth. Eliza opened the door just long enough to clear the room, then closed it again against the cold. Soot gathered where it hadn't before, along the stove legs, across the cooking shelf. Eliza wiped it away each morning with a damp cloth. None of this was dramatic. That was the danger of it. It was a slow grind, the kind that wore people down without announcing itself. Xander said very little. He did not blame the stove. He did not blame the woodcutter who had sold him logs in the fall. He watched the fire instead. He noticed what happened before the flames took hold, how moisture beaded on the surface of a log even before it touched the heat, how the wood seemed to breathe out water. The problem was not rain. The pile had been covered. Snow had stayed mostly outside the stack. What soaked the wood came from somewhere else. Wood absorbs moisture from the air. It always has. In a place where days softened and nights froze, that moisture had nowhere to go. Each thaw pulled dampness inward. Each freeze locked it there. The logs were not wet on the outside. They were wet all the way through. Wood was sweating before it burned. That was the moment the problem sharpened. Not as a theory, but as a threat that reached across the room and touched his family directly. A fire that could not be trusted was not just an inconvenience. It was a risk that waited for the wrong night to demand payment. Xander did not curse the winter. He did not argue with it. He did what his old work had taught him to do. He watched where the water went. Xander did not try to fix the old method. He did not add more tarps. He did not build a tighter lean-to or stack the wood higher off the ground. Those were refinements, and refinements still played by the same rules. What failed him was not effort. It was location. The wood was fighting the weather because it lived where the weather had control. Xander stopped thinking about how to keep wood dry. He started thinking about where winter lost its leverage. Below the frost line, the ground did not care about night or day. Temperatures changed slowly there. No sudden thaws. No hard locks of ice. Just steady, patient, cold. Earth insulated the way timber never could. It muted swings. It softened extremes. It absorbed what air could not. And water, if given a path, followed gravity. It always had. It did not argue. It did not linger without a reason. Xander had learned that lesson years earlier. On rail cars, water that could not escape waited for cold to do the damage. Water that was guided away lost its power. So he stopped looking for a drier corner of the yard. He stopped trying to outcover the sky. He looked down instead. Not a root cellar for vegetables, not a storm shelter, a wood vault, a place set low enough that winter could not rush in, a place where heat did not spike and vanish, a place where moisture could leave instead of being trapped. He did not imagine comfort. He imagined stability. Under the ground, the rules were different. Daylight did not melt and refreeze by the hour. Wind did not pry at seams. Snow could pile up and mean nothing. The idea did not arrive with excitement. It arrived quietly, the way practical answers often do after the wrong ones have been exhausted. He did not look for somewhere drier. He looked for somewhere winter could not interfere. Below the frost line, cold still existed, but it moved slowly enough to be planned for. Below the frost line, water still flowed, but only if it was given no reason to stay. Changing the space meant changing the rules. And once Xander saw that, the decision was already made. The first man to speak against the idea did not raise his voice. He did not laugh. He did not need to. Thomas Hale, a cattleman who had wintered stock in the valley for years and buried more than one bad idea with a shovel in time. When he saw the stakes in the ground near the coal cabin, he stopped. "You dig that close," Hale said. "You invite water, not accusation. A statement." He pointed at the earth. "At thaw, it moves. Then at the cabin. And when it moves, it looks for somewhere to go." Hale had seen it before. Cellars that filled without warning. Foundations that shifted just enough to crack walls by spring. "You're cutting a hollow next to your own supports," he said. "That's how houses get lost." Not dramatic. Just experience speaking plainly. Xander did not answer right away. He crouched and pressed his palm to the dirt. Then he stood and stepped 2 paces away from the wall. He pointed down the slope. He traced a line in the air with 2 fingers. "Offset," he said. Then, "Drain." That was it. Hale frowned. "Summer ground lies," he said. "Winter tells the truth." Xander nodded once. He did not disagree. He did not explain further. Eliza stood in the doorway and watched the exchange. She knew what was being weighed. Not pride, not cleverness. A roof, a floor, a place for a child to sleep. Others had gathered by then. Men passing with tools. A woman carrying water. They slowed. They listened. Someone chuckled under their breath. Another shook his head. Digging near a house was a known mistake. Hale looked around at the small audience. "If it floods," he said, "don't come asking for boards to brace your walls." Xander met his eyes. There was no challenge there, only acknowledgement. He didn't argue. He didn't defend the idea. He didn't sell it. He measured. Distance from the wall. Direction of the slope. The way water would be allowed to leave. The watching didn't stop. Neither did the doubt. And as words spread through the valley, the pressure began to take shape. Xander began before the ground hardened, before frost set its teeth, before winter decided what it would allow. He marked the cut with stakes and string, set back from the cabin wall, far enough to keep the house out of the argument. Then he started digging. The earth came up in layers. Topsoil first, then heavier clay. Below that, colder ground that held its shape. By the time he reached depth, the pit stood just over 6 feet down. He did not hurry. He checked the walls by touch, pressed a thumb into the soil, listened for the dull sound that meant collapse later. From the creek below the cabin, he carried smooth stones, river-worn, rounded. They went into the bottom first, spread thick enough to break standing water. Over the stone, he packed ash, cold ash, the kind that absorbed damp without holding it, pressed flat with the heel of his boot. Then came the channel, a shallow cut sloping away from the house, angled just enough to give water a reason to leave. Not a ditch you noticed. A path water would recognize. The walls rose next, fieldstones set without mortar, each piece chosen for fit, not size. Weight, holding weight, friction doing the rest. Above the stone, he framed with split timber, not milled boards, wood cleaved along its grain, strong where it needed to be, flexible where it mattered. Between the upper timbers, he left narrow gaps, not mistakes, openings planned for air, set opposite each other so nothing stayed still inside. The vents were wood, too, hollowed carefully, angled so falling snow would pass over them, set off center to avoid drawing wind straight through. On the downhill side, he cut the loading entrance. Low, narrow, just enough for a man bent at the waist. The door faced away from prevailing weather. Inside the cabin, he worked the floor last. Boards lifted and set aside, joists doubled, a square opening framed tight. The trapdoor fit flush, lined with scraps, hinged to close under its own weight. When shut, it held the room's heat where it belonged. There was no speech when the work was done. No gathering. No test. The pit stood quiet beneath the house. Stone holding. Wood braced. Paths cut for things that moved whether invited or not. Xander brushed dirt from his hands. He stood and looked once more at the slope, the walls, the distance from the cabin's weight. The system existed now. Complete, but unproven. Nature had not been asked for approval. It never was. The ground waited. Silas Merrick did not come to watch a curiosity. He came because he had learned to recognize risk. For years he had been a bridge foreman, building timber spans over frozen creeks and mountain cuts across the Sawtooth Range. Structures that failed quietly. And then all at once, he stood at the edge of Xander's excavation and said nothing. No smile. No warning yet. Just time. He looked first at the loading entrance, the height, the direction it faced. Then he followed the slope with his eyes, tracing where meltwater would want to go. He knelt and touched the fresh soil, pressed it between his fingers, and let it fall. Silas did not speak in theories. He spoke in seasons. Spring melt, he said at last. The word landed hard because everyone knew what it meant. Not snow, not cold, water, released all at once. Silas explained it the way bridgemen always did. Water does not obey plans. It does not care what a builder intended. It moves toward the weakest point and waits. When snow melts quickly on frozen ground, it cannot sink. It skates sideways, riding the ice beneath the soil like glass. It spreads, searches, and gathers speed. Hollows invite it. Empty spaces call it in. A void under the earth becomes a promise water is eager to keep. I've seen abutments rot without ever getting wet on the surface, Silas said. Seen posts heave that looked solid all winter. He tapped the ground once with his boot. This is when they fail. Xander listened without interrupting. He did not defend the work. He did not claim certainty. When Silas finished, Xander pointed not at the walls, but at the cut running away from the house. The drainage path, shallow and deliberate. Then, at the grade beyond it, water leaves, he said. Because it can. Silas shook his head slowly. Summer slopes lie, he replied. Winter bends everything. It was not an insult. It was a warning earned the hard way. Eliza stood a few steps back, hands folded, watching the exchange. She understood the weight of it better than most. If Silas was right, the cost would not be extra firewood. It would be the house itself. Silas straightened and took one last look at the vault, at the stone, at the timber, at the space beneath a family's floor. I'm not saying you're wrong, he said. I'm saying the test hasn't happened yet. Then he turned to leave. Spring will decide, he added over his shoulder. No one laughed after that. No one spoke. The idea had crossed a line. This was no longer about dry wood. It was about whether a man had placed a weakness where winter would remember it. The work stood finished. The argument was not. And somewhere ahead, the clock had been set. Winter closed the roads before it closed the valley. Wagon ruts filled. Passes vanished. Mail stopped coming through, and the small post station became something else. It became a place of exchange. Salt for lamp oil, nails for candle stubs, and more than anything else, wood for whatever a household could spare. The woman who kept that station was Abigail Rowe, a schoolteacher by training who served as the winter post clerk when snow cut the lines. She did not trade, she recorded. Abigail kept a ledger because winter demanded one. Names, dates, amounts, who brought in bundles, who asked for credit, who needed help and how often. She listened more than she spoke. When men argued about weather, she kept writing. When blame passed from tarp to stove to bad luck, she kept writing. Ink did not care about opinions. The talk about Xander Cole reached her the same way all talk did, half jokes, half warnings, passed across the counter with cold hands wrapped around cups. A hole under his house. Crazy. Brave. Maybe. Stupid. Abigail did not comment. She asked what she always asked. How much? The pages began to fill. 3 bundles here, 2 there. A full stack gone before Christmas in one cabin. A second request before New Year's in another. Patterns emerged without anyone meaning them to. Some names appeared again and again. Some households burned through their reserves faster than they planned. Some asked early. Some asked often. When Abigail reached the letter C, she paused. She ran her finger down the column. Checked dates. Checked amounts. Then she wrote a single line. Cole, no requests yet. No underline. No mark in the margin. Just ink placed where it belonged. She closed the ledger and set it aside. Not as evidence. Not as judgment. Just as record. Outside, winter continued doing what it always did. It took heat. It demanded fuel. It exposed weak plans without explanation. Inside the post station, the truth was being measured quietly, not by thermometers, not by arguments, by what left the woodpiles and how quickly it disappeared. The valley would keep talking. Stories would grow louder as nights grew longer. But winter, as it always had, was already keeping score. And there were only ever 2 kinds of people when the cold settled in. Those who told stories and those who kept the ledger. By the time the first hard freezes arrived, the story had already taken shape. It traveled faster than the weather. Cole dug a hole next to his house, people said, not as a warning, as something between a joke and a rumor. At the trading shed, where hands stayed busy to keep from going numb, someone laughed and asked if he planned to sleep underground with his firewood. The others smiled, not cruelly, just enough to ease their own doubt. Mockery on the frontier rarely sounded sharp. It sounded familiar, like concern wearing a grin. Thomas Hale did not bother with humor. He spoke plainly, the way men did when they believed time would prove them right. If that pit fills, he said, where others could hear, don't come asking me for boards to brace your walls. Not a threat, a boundary. Heads nodded. No one argued. Everyone understood what he meant. Later, as Eliza passed through with a sack of flour under her arm, an older woman reached out and caught her sleeve, lowered her voice. He means well, she said. Then, more quietly, is your husband sure about this? Eliza did not answer. She did not defend Xander. She did not reassure the woman or herself. She only nodded once and continued on. That night, the lamp burned low in the coal cabin. Outside, the wind worried at the eaves. Inside, Xander sat at the table with a scrap of paper and a stub of charcoal. He did not draw plans. He did not write explanations. He sketched angles, a line for the slope, a mark for the drain, numbers written small along the edge, measured and remeasured until they made sense. He erased nothing. He crossed out nothing. When he finished, he folded the paper and set it aside. Eliza watched from the stove. She did not ask what he was doing. She did not praise the work. She watched the way a person watches a scale settle, knowing the weight mattered more than the outcome. This was the cost no one else carried. Not the laughter, not the looks. The risk lived under their floor. It waited for thaw, for water, for gravity to decide whether the ground would hold. Xander did not argue his case to the valley. He did not try to convert anyone. He trusted measurement more than agreement, distance more than reassurance, slope more than hope. The paper stayed folded. The lamp went out. Outside, winter pressed closer. Inside, the house held its breath, and the quiet pressure of doubt, of waiting, of what might happen when the snow let go, settled in alongside the cold. Winter did not arrive as a single event. It arrived in cycles. Fine snow fell first, light enough to sweep away. Then daylight softened it into water that crept where it could. Night followed, sealing everything back into ice. The pattern repeated. Again. Again. Tarps sagged under the weight. Ropes stretched. Corners loosened just enough for water to slip beneath. By the time anyone noticed, it was already inside the stacks. In Thomas Hale's yard, the morning work grew harder. Logs that should have lifted clean came apart in frozen pairs. He pried them loose with the axe handle, breath clouding as he worked. When the fire was lit, it took its time. Kindling burned down before the larger pieces caught. Smoke pressed back into the room, thick and sharp. The chimney began to smell wrong. Creosote, the warning scent men learned to fear. Other cabins fared no better. Some burned through their good wood early and turned to greener cuts. Others broke down old fencing, split shed boards, anything that would catch long enough to cook a meal. The valley adjusted the way it always had, by lowering expectations, by shortening nights, by telling themselves this was normal. But the cost was rising. Fires burned hot and fast, then collapsed. Stoves demanded constant attention. Sleep came in pieces. Outside, the weather kept moving. Snow, melt, freeze, then rain that froze where it landed. Ice glazed roofs. Lean toes bowed. Wood piles darkened. Through it all, Xander Cole moved quietly. He did not change his routine. He did not comment on anyone else's trouble. Each evening, he crossed the yard to the downhill door, bent, entered the vault, returned with dry wood held close to his chest. There was no announcement, no comparison. If someone noticed, he did not meet their eyes. The difference was not dramatic yet. That was the danger of it. Winter rarely broke people all at once. It wore them down by inches, by nights that ended too soon, by mornings that asked for more than yesterday had left behind. The ledger at the post station grew thicker. Names repeated. Requests came earlier. Bundles disappeared faster. No one called it failure. They called it a hard season. But the ground was already making distinctions. It was deciding which plans bent and which ones cracked, which systems burned fuel, and which ones conserved it. This was the stretch where people began to count nights, to ask how long their wood would last, to measure winter, not by weeks, but by fires. And somewhere in the back of every mind, the same question waited for an answer. If the fire will not hold, how many nights are left to fix it? The storm did not rush in. It settled. Snow came first, heavy and unbroken, falling long enough to erase paths and memory alike. Then the temperature climbed just enough to turn edges soft. Rain followed cold, persistent and cruel. When night returned, everything froze where it stood. Ice sealed tarps to wood piles. It locked doors in place. It filled tracks as fast as they were made. Wind pushed through every seam the cabins had ever tolerated. Drifts rose until lean-to roofs vanished beneath them. What had once been shelter became a buried guess. By the third day, no one bothered checking the stacks. There was nothing to check. The fourth day brought silence, the kind that followed exhaustion. Snow stopped falling, but the wind stayed sharp, carving lines across the valley. When the storm finally loosened its grip, the cold arrived without apology. The temperature dropped to near -18 degrees and stayed there. Outside, everything turned to stone. Tarps were frozen solid into the wood beneath them. Storage doors refused to open. Sheds could not be reached without digging. Some men burned fence rails. Others split packing crates and old barrels. Anything dry enough to hold flame for a few minutes became fuel. The valley had run out of margin. Nature did not shout. It did not punish. It simply removed options, one by one. No path to the pile. No access to dry wood. No way to correct what should have been fixed weeks earlier. Inside the cabins, people stayed close to their stoves. They listened to the fire more than they watched it. Every pop, every collapse of embers mattered. This was the moment systems were exposed. Not by theory, not by debate, by constraint. When you could not go outside. When tools froze to the touch. When the night did not care how prepared you believed yourself to be. The old methods had reached their end. They had no answers left to give, and the valley felt it not as panic, but as a tightening in the chest. A quiet realization shared across walls and distance. There were no choices left, only consequences. And one question pressed harder than the cold itself. When you can't go out, when the weather owns the yard, how do you reach fire at all? The night after the storm was not quiet, but it was different. Xander Cole was awake, not from fear, but because the wind had changed its rhythm. The long push had eased. The sharp edges had dulled. He rose without haste and crossed the room. The stove sat dark, waiting. The kitchen floor held its shape in the low light. He knelt and lifted the trapdoor. Cold air tried to follow him down. It pressed in for a moment, then stopped. The thick lid closed behind him and cut the draft clean. Xander descended the ladder slowly, not into warmth, into steadiness. Below the floor, the air did not steam. It did not bite. It did not smell of smoke or damp wood. The space held its temperature the way Earth always had, without hurry, without spikes, without apology. His boots met packed ground, dry stone, no standing water, no frost blooming along the walls. He reached into the stack and lifted a log. It was lighter than it should have been, dry to the touch, no glaze of ice, no hidden weight. He took 2 more and climbed back up. In the kitchen, the stove door opened. Kindling went in. Then the log. The flame caught immediately. No hiss, no steam, no struggle. Fire took hold the way it was meant to. Clean, direct. Heat began to spread before smoke ever thought of forming. Xander added the second piece and closed the door. The stove settled into its work. Eliza stood beside him. She said nothing. She held her hand out toward the iron and waited, not for comfort, for confirmation. The warmth reached her fingers steadily, not in a burst, not in a promise that would collapse in minutes. She did not smile. She did not speak. She simply kept her hand there a moment longer, as if measuring something she could finally trust. Outside, the valley remained locked in ice. Tarps stayed frozen. Doors stayed buried. None of it mattered in that moment. The weather had done its worst. It had taken every option it could reach. And still, beneath the floor, the system held. Dry wood spoke without words. The trapdoor turned the storm into background noise. For the first time since winter had tightened its grip, the house did not ask for anything more. It gave. By mid-January, the arguments had grown tired, not louder, just worn thin. Men said the Cole house had been lucky, that the storm had shifted, that any system looks smart once it survives the worst of it. The talk reached the post station the way all talk did, carried in on cold boots, set down on the counter, left there to warm itself. Abigail Rowe did not look up when the names were mentioned. She did not interrupt. She waited until the voices thinned on their own. Then she opened the ledger. She did not stand. She did not clear her throat. She read exactly what she had written. I've been keeping the winter ledger. Ink marked dates. Numbers held their places. Same valley. Same storms. No one argued that. By mid-January, most homes had burned through 3 stacks. There was a pause. Not for effect, because pages need turning. The Cole house hadn't finished its second. Silence followed. Not surprise. Recognition. No opinions, she said. Just what left the woodpile. That was all. The ledger closed. The conversation did not resume. There was nothing left to debate. Winter loosened slowly after that. Not in surrender, but in stages. 3 warm days arrived late in the season. Sunlight softened the drifts. Snow on the upper slopes released its grip all at once. The ground beneath remained cold, hard, unforgiving. Water had nowhere to sink, so it moved sideways, sliding along frozen soil, testing every weakness it could find. This was the moment Silas Merrick had been waiting for. He returned without warning, without an audience, without accusation. He stood at the trapdoor and nodded once. Xander opened it. The ladder descended into the earth. The vault lay quiet below, stone dry, timber firm. Silas climbed down slowly and crouched near the floor. He ran his hand across the packed surface, followed the grade with his eyes. Outside, water moved. Inside, it did not stay. The drainage path did its work. Moisture was guided away from the hollow, pulled downslope, denied a place to settle. Silas remained still for a long moment. Then, he stood. It held, he said. Not praise, not relief, a conclusion. The kind bridgemen trusted with weight. Weeks later, when the mud retreated and paths returned, Silas came back. This time, he stepped inside. He asked no broad questions, only the ones that mattered. How much slope before water slows? Why face the entrance that way? How thick before ash stops absorbing? How do the vents avoid drawing snow? Xander answered without lecturing. He pointed. He tapped. He traced lines with a finger where water would travel. Silas did not write anything down. He walked the system again, the way he had once walked a bridge before letting the first wagon cross. At the end, he stood near the opening and spoke quietly. I built bridges thinking water was something to fight, he said. You built this, assuming water would win. It was not a request for instruction. It was acknowledgement. The kind men of skill offer rarely, and only when the ground has already spoken. The first to ask publicly was Thomas Hale. He did not apologize. He did not explain himself. He asked where to place the door, how far to keep from the foundation, what to do when the slope ran the wrong way. Others followed, not with copies, but with variations. Some dug shallow vaults tight to their houses. Some built smaller pits meant to last a single winter. Some adapted old cellars and changed their angles. No two were the same. All three principles were stable ground, a way out for water, air that moved without inviting weather in. Over 4 winters, 14 homesteads in the Sawtooth Valley built their own versions. None of them named it after Xander Cole. He did not teach classes. He did not charge. When asked why something worked, he answered the same way every time. Watch where the water goes. That was the lesson. Nothing more. By the 5th winter, the valley burned differently. Fires lasted longer. Stoves asked for less. Chimneys stayed cleaner. Wood stopped being something people feared losing early. The change did not come with celebration. It came with quiet copying. Nature had already ruled. The storms had asked their questions. Only one place had answered the same way every time. On the frontier, stubborn men get buried, but men who let the ground teach them get copied. And long after the storms passed on, that lesson stayed right where it had always belonged, beneath the floor, doing its work in silence. If you'd lived in that valley, would you have called this shelter reckless or quietly copied it?